Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. In this video, I'm going to explain how socialism has evolved. Because quite often I watch these videos where Mr. Ben Shapiro, I kept saying Shapiro, but I've been corrected, Stephen Crowder, others of his ilk, Dinesh D'Souza, and so on, they are tearing into socialism. Now, I am not a socialist. I've never been a part of any socialist organisation. The only political party I ever belonged to was the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. So I don't agree with socialism. There are some aspects of socialism which sometimes can be a little bit good. Of course, it can go very badly wrong. And there have been the most horrific, unimaginable tyrannies which have been socialist, or more accurately, communist ones. But quite often when people are lambasting socialism, they're attacking a straw man, or not socialism as it really exists anymore. So socialism, like any other ideology, is a living animal, and it has evolved. So there's socialist nostra, which go back to ancient Greece, although then they also had slavery at the same time. So for the free people in a Greek city-state, there could be aspects of socialism, of common ownership, of public services, yet they denied any human rights to certain categories of people, even from other parts of Greece that they happened to capture. But there we go. Socialism is not a new thing, and people will often point to Marx, particularly those who wish to excoriate socialism. So Marx wasn't the first socialist thinker or the inventor of the word. He was one among many. As it happened, it was his particular strain of socialism that people really ran with into the 20th century and forged communist states and so on, which were predicated on the principles he propounded in the Communist Manifesto and in Das Kapital and so on. And there was always a spirited debate within socialism, and then socialism sort of split from communism, but communists sometimes call themselves socialists, so it's a bit complex, and we can get stuck into quibbling over the definitions of these things. So a lot of Marx's views weren't even accepted at his own time by many fellow socialists, even by the time he died in 1883. But so let's look at the first successful attempt to found a socialist or perhaps a communist state. That was the October Revolution, 1917, in Russia. And there was the Petrograd Soviet, as in like City Council of Petrograd. And there were 19 political parties in that, 9 of which were socialist of one description or other. So one of those was the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks in 1918 renamed themselves the Communists. So, but of all the socialist parties, remember, the communists were one amongst 9. So they were arguing with the others and indeed fighting the others. And when I say that, I mean that in the literal sense, and killing them from October 1917 onwards. The Bolsheviks were fighting against the socialist revolutionaries, against the Trudoviki, against the Mensheviks, and so on, and various separatist socialists, as in Polish socialists who wanted independence for Poland, Ukrainian socialists who wanted independence for the Ukraine, Azerbaijani socialists who wanted independence for their country, and so forth. So it's an incredibly vociferous movement, and there's more than one understanding of what socialism really is. So this is not 1917, and the ideology has evolved. Like every other political ideology, people move forward, they change their views, they drop this aspect of it, they continue with certain other aspects of it, they adopt new policies and things like that, and people can be a bit syncretic. We can pick and mix from ideologies. So I think the trouble with some of those who choose to savage socialism all the time is they're too much into identity politics, sometimes ethnic or religious identity, but also just belonging to an ideology, a camp, saying the right or this, the left or that. And anything bad, they try and say that's the left, even when that's misleading, and they falsify the historical record, particularly with regard to Nazism and so on. We'll look back in private property. Well, socialists didn't completely, or communists, in fact, in 1917 did not completely abolish private property. It's true they confiscated large estates and businesses and so on, but they allowed peasant proprietorship. And indeed, Bertrand Russell, a British socialist thinker, he criticised Lenin face-to-face, saying that you've allowed the peasants to own their farms. And Lenin was saying that's okay, so long as these are small holdings, but people are not permitted to possess landed estates and rent things out. The rentier class can no longer be locusts, just living off the sweat of the brow of journeymen and tenants. Because if you own land, you're not providing a service and you're not producing anything, you're just getting the rent for doing nothing, for land that your robber baron ancestor had gained by the sword centuries earlier. So, and then the little bit of common ownership the communists had introduced, they soon got rid of. The new economic policy, which is of course the old economic policy. So communists have allowed large measures of capitalism. It's true that in the late 20s they got rid of that and they collectivized lots of farms. But then by the 1980s, in the Soviet Union, they'd reintroduced elements of free enterprise. So the communist experiment in the Soviet Union, the real communist bit of the public owning almost everything, that lasted for about 65 years. So you were allowed to own personal effects like your clothes or toys or books or things like that, but not property and housing. So anyway, in many respects it was cataclysmic, and I don't advocate for that. But the idea that socialist or even communist governments would never allow private ownership or, say, houses is not true, or indeed farms. Look at North Korea. It's often had corporations set up there, South Korean corporations set up there. And North Koreans are sometimes allowed to go abroad, set up restaurants in China. I've been to one of them. Or to work for private companies in Russia and construction and so forth. Look at Romania. When it was ruled by the Communist Party, one-party state, it allowed people to buy their flats and houses. Flats or apartments, of course. And that's why Romania today has got the highest rate of home ownership in the world, 96%. So look at Cuba now, and for 10 years or more, it has allowed small-scale capitalism, people to own bed and breakfasts and restaurants and things like that. So communism and capitalism are not inimical to each other. Almost every society has a mixture of them. It depends how much, which things you should be publicly owned, which services are best provided by the government and which are best left to the market. So these days, virtually nobody says that the state should own all the means of production, distribution, and exchange. And that's what communists were originally into. So Mr. Crowder, for example, was saying that socialism is evil. Well, funny that, because obviously the United States has got elements of socialism, such as, say, Amtrak, the state-owned railway or railroad system. And if the United States obviously is virtuous, as he thinks it is, and socialism is evil, as he contends, therefore the United States would never form an alliance with a government, with a country which is a socialist government. Look at the EU countries or the European NATO countries. Virtually all of them have been led by a socialist party at one time or other, whilst they were staunch allies of the United States. Surely that would be impossible if what they're doing was evil. And then the United States has sometimes been against much more capitalist organizations or governments. Well, say the Taliban, quite capitalist. They certainly have no objection to private ownership, or maybe Saddam Hussein's Iraq allowing elements of it. So, India, fairly close relationship with the United States, and the Congress Party ruled them for quite a bit, and Congress was socialist a long time ago, to talk about socialism. Or Australia was ruled by its Labour Party for some time, a socialist party, but the Australian Labour Party has never taken away people's houses or stopped people having businesses that make profits, things like that. So none of them advocate state control of everything. Or, Pakistan was ruled by the Pakistan People's Party, which called itself socialist and believed in socialist economics, but didn't seize control of everything or public services and on and on. So you could point this out about socialist parties in almost every country these days, that they don't advocate state control of everything, of confiscating all businesses and so on. Some of them would believe in having some publicly owned things, or the mineral resources should sometimes be used for the public good, and think about the common weal. But it is really oversimplistic and disingenuous to pretend that socialists believe in state ownership of everything. So they would want some limits on capitalism or public services, or saying Norway is not a socialist country, and indeed it's not. It's got aspects of socialism, more extensively defined in the United States, greater public provision of certain services. Anyway, the federal government is absolutely useless at everything it does. Well, not the military, according to these right-wing demagogues. But the federal government would be woeful at providing healthcare. That's Mr. Crowder's line. If so, isn't it astonishing that the Veterans Administration exists? Now, Mr. Crowder is a vociferous advocate of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, of course, in his rallies, was pledging to do everything he could for the Veterans Administration, providing publicly funded healthcare for people who'd served in the US military. But if the federal government is so dreadful at providing healthcare, they shouldn't. Abolish the Veterans Administration. Oddly, I'd never heard Mr. Crowder call for that, or really anyone who supports the Republican Party and Trump say, let's get rid of that. What a waste of money. These freebooters are so lazy, they should pay for it themselves. Tough. And actually, the Veterans Administration overall provides superb healthcare. And I don't know of any US military veterans who don't want it. Now, some of them are very wealthy and can afford to just go private straight away. But apart from those who are very rich, I think most of them are very glad to have it. But anyway, Crowder doesn't say that should be abolished. How about farm subsidies? Strange that. I don't hear the Republican Party saying, well, let's no longer subsidize farms. Because farmers, they're often, rural whites, Christian fundamentalists, gun owners, just the sort of demographic who are quite likely to be loyal Republican voters. So there has to be pork. This is redistribution of wealth. The very thing that Mr. Crowder contends is utterly wicked. How villainous to tax people, including the super rich, and take some of their lucre and give it to needy farmers. We can't possibly tolerate that. But, Mr. Crowder, he never says that ought to be done away with. Perhaps he believes it should. Well, I'd like to hear him say so. How about gasoline subsidies? Gasoline is petrol, by the way, if you're British. Why not get rid of those? Okay, that would be deeply unpopular. Gas prices would go up, and most American voters wouldn't like that, so they keep it. So even the Republican Party is doing that, and that is redistribution of wealth. These are taxes which are hitting everyone, particularly the affluent, and it's providing something for a lower price to the general public. So it's a subvention. But what if these gasoline subsidies were axed? Well then, so gasoline prices would go up, but renewable energy might have more of a chance, be more of a level playing field, and there might be more public transport. Now, I realise in the United States, being such a gigantic country, the population being so diffuse, public transport is simply not a viable option in very rural areas. But just outside the major cities, there's scarcely any public transport in terms of buses, trains, trams, or whatever. But if going by car was more expensive, then public transport might be more of a feasible thing, and people might think it was more attractive. Instead of making people feel like a loser for using public transport, say, no, you're good, you're responsible, you're taking the pressure off the planet, and you're sensible with your money, of course. So just pointing out that socialism moves on, and all ideologies move on. Take conservatism. Well, John Wilson Croker was the first one to use the word socialism, conservatism in 1828, conservative to mean a political outlook. And what conservatives believe today is unrecognizable compared to what they believed in 1828. In most countries, conservatives would have advocated for legal and religious discrimination by law, or say that most men should be allowed to vote, and that no woman should be allowed to vote, and there should be no publicly funded schooling and things like that. Or that aristocrats should have legal privileges, or monarchs should have actual political power, that slavery ought to be permitted, loads of things like that, things which are anathema to virtually any conservative these days. Or when the word liberal was first used in a political connotation in 1812, again, what liberals believed then was not at all what liberal by modern standards. So socialism, like liberalism, like conservatism, like anarchism, or like any ideology, moves forward, and it changes over time, just as people change and we respond to new situations, and people experiment with policies, and sometimes they come to fruition, and sometimes they're unsuccessful. So people adapt, and you can pick and mix and believe in a little bits of different policies. So you see conservative leaders like Margaret Thatcher, who advocated for publicly funded health care and the public ownership of the Royal Mail. That's the postal service. Or in France, right-wing presidents and prime ministers advocating for some public ownership for extensive public services. So socialism and capitalism can coexist, and we can have a mixed economy. Like in the United Kingdom from 1945 to the early 80s, there was a thing called Butskelism, because of Rab Butler, the Conservative Chancellor Exchequer, that's finance minister, and Hugh Gaitskell, the Labour or the Socialist Chancellor of the Exchequer, remember Chancellor of the Exchequer as finance minister, them having a mixed economy of some public ownership, some private ownership, and extensive public provision of services. So often it was inefficient. I don't advocate a return to that. However, it is a very simplistic fallacy to claim that socialism and capitalism must be at loggerheads. They're not necessarily hostile to each other. One can have a melange of the two and try to find some sort of Aristotelian mean between them. And even these so-called advocates of free market policies often don't believe them in practice. They don't want a free market quite often in drugs and prostitution and gambling, even in tobacco, even in alcohol, or certainly quite low age, sort of quite high age restrictions on alcohol. Say 21 in the United States, when if you're a real capitalist, you'd have it lower at 18 if that's legal majority, or even lower like in Germany, the Netherlands, like 16, things like that. So it's notable that many of these anti-socialists in the United States are also staunch advocates of everything Israel does, a country which is mostly founded by socialists and governed by socialists for the earlier half of its history. Ergo, these right-wingers in the United States ought to think that Israel is damnably vile, how utterly wicked it is to be socialist, and especially when it's fighting against capitalist countries. So I see the many inconsistencies and hypocrisies in the facile drivel that they often broadcast.